Welcome, Robert Sternberg, to ESF and our snowy city of Syracuse. You're a biologist and a filmmaker who is here visiting us from the Science Communications Department at Imperial College of London. You're here today to tell us about one of your colleagues, Donald Williamson, who is an evolutionary biologist and who has some rather controversial ideas and who's stirring a bit of controversy over those ideas. So I wonder if we could start by telling us a little bit about Donald Williamson and kind of put us in the picture of who he is and what his theory is and why it's controversial.
Okay, well, thank you. Donald Williamson is a marine biologist. He started his work in marine biology back in the 1940s. He's quite elderly now. In fact, I'm here on his behalf for that reason. He couldn't make the trip. And he was a standard marine biologist for the majority of his career. But he became an expert in the plankton, and his work was in studying to a large extent, in studying how crustaceans started as planktonic forms and eventually grew into the crabs and lobsters, etc., that we're all familiar with.
The plankton are the small little things that float around in the ocean.
Exactly, all the small little things that are more or less microscopic, and many marine organisms start their life as planktonic forms, and they later metamorphose into the adult forms that we're familiar with. So Williamson spent 40 years studying these things. He became an expert in these, and towards the end of his career he started to think about some of the strange anomalies, as he saw them, that had arisen during his career, things that he really couldn't explain according to orthodox theories about evolution I'm talking about. So he has come up with a new idea, specifically to explain those marine animals that have got planktonic larvae, intermediate forms in their life histories. The ideas are controversial because, well, let's put it this way. The great achievement of Charles Darwin was to suggest that a single process was responsible for how animals became adapted to their environment, and if you push that process for long enough, and if the environment might change sufficiently, that same process could produce a new species. Well, Williamson doesn't deny that that process we call natural selection takes place and is very important, but he doesn't think it's sufficient to explain how some of these marine animals got the life histories that they have, how they developed a larval stage, which is so very different from the adult stage that we're familiar with. I'm talking about starfishes and sea urchins.
So starfish start out as something much different from the typical kind of starfish that we see sitting on the shore. And can you describe to us how they're different?
Yeah, the starfish will release its egg into the sea, where if it's lucky, it will meet the sperm of another starfish, and the result is something called a bipinnaria larva. It's very small, and it's bilaterally symmetrical, so you could divide it down the middle, and the two halves would reflect each other. The starfish, as we all know, is a radially symmetrical organism. It's basically circular or five-sided, and so the adult looks very different from its larva. And one of the strange things about how the adult grows from the larva is that it doesn't develop from the larva in the way that we would imagine. What happens is that some few small cells within the larva will grow, and they'll produce a tiny five-pointed juvenile starfish, which migrates to the outside of the larva, then it falls off, and it starts its life on the seabed, eating and growing, and they can grow very large. So the larva is often left swimming around, and it will eventually disintegrate. But it's a very different form of metamorphosis to that which we usually imagine, where the larva is totally absorbed and disappears in the creation of the adult.
So this is an anomaly that our standard models of at least modern Darwinism have a difficult time dealing with.
They have a difficult time dealing, because it's hard to imagine what use, if you like, such a process. It seems very wasteful. Yeah. You know, you've gone to a lot of effort to make a larva. It seems crazy that it should go on having any kind of existence after the adult has emerged.
Yeah. You mentioned that that Darwin's great achievement was in understanding something about the evolution of forms through gradual modification, and this multi-stage process of larval to adult development seems to run counter to that. One of the interesting things about Donald Williamson, I think, is that he represents an old school of evolutionary thought that Darwin himself was very steeped in, but that we seem to have got away from in modern times. And yet, this old school is something that refuses to lie down and die. There's still a lot of interesting things to come from that. And I'm just curious, how did you come to know Donald Williamson? That is someone who is working in what many people think is the backwaters of science. And how did you come to be associated with him? And tell us a little bit about what it was like to work with him.
Okay, well, I got to know him because I was trying to make another program. It's often the way with filmmakers that they meet their next subject on their current project. I was looking to talk to people who had something to say about symbiosis. And I had come to the United States and I had met Lynn Margulis and a number of other workers. And in that process I heard about Williamson. Now, Williamson's idea is not exactly a symbiotic idea, but one can see how it's related to that. So I went to meet him. I thought he could maybe be in this. It was a radio program I was making, and I interviewed him. But I found that his work really was well, it was too way out really to be included in that particular piece. But I was very impressed with him. He's a very passionate man. He had had a stroke by the time I had met him, which meant that he had been unable to pursue his ideas practically for some time. And I thought, I could see a good story there, and I offered him my services, as it were, as a pair of hands, to do some experiments, in return for which he would let me film our experience and try and say something about his work. So initially I went to he works on an island off the coast in the Irish Sea between the United Kingdom and Ireland. And it's a small marine biology station. I went and worked for 2 months there. We did a whole series of experiments, breeding starfish and sea urchins together and this sort of thing. And I recorded all the material that I eventually cut into my film. And of course, that's a very intense sort of experience. You're working with somebody every day, and you're looking after him. In a way, I was his sort of amanuensis and general factotum. I had to do a lot of stuff. So I really got to know him well, and of course I got to like him a great deal. And since then, that was quite a few years ago, I've taken him to conferences. I've done whatever I can really to help him get his ideas out there. And at least he's now quite elderly, and he would like to think that he's left something of lasting value that people will take seriously.
I thought your documentary, which is called Hopeful Monsters, an Experiment, captured the nature of this very laborious and actually difficult science that is involved in this classical kind of zoology. And the thing that I was struck the most about it was that it didn't really have a happy ending in the experiment. And it illustrated, amongst other things, that failure is really an important part of successful experimental science. I wonder if you could elaborate on that theme a bit.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that, and it's kind of hard to miss it in a sense. But it is true. I mean, no orthodox science documentary would have made the story that I made, because I can't think of a single instance when a failed experiment is the center of a film about science. And yet, if you're a scientist or if you know scientists, you will be aware that the majority of experiments don't work out. Or if they work out, the results are in some sense unclear and require interpretation. And so I was very keen to put across this aspect of scientific work, that in a way it speaks of the commitment and the passion of the scientists, that they carry on despite these setbacks, despite these failures. And it's in the film, of course, despite his, the fact that the experiments did not produce what we had hoped they would, we're well aware that Williamson will carry on. He will do the next experiment, the next conference, the next opportunity to promote his ideas. And so it should be, and so it always has been. It's, not only is science full of failures, it's much less of a rigorous or logical practice than I think is generally understood. And it's not understood because most science documentaries take a strictly sort of argumentative structure and present a story as you might find it in a textbook. Of course, actual practice is much messier than that. It involves other people who have to help you or who might disagree with you, and it involves the vagaries of experimentation as well.
You're a biologist and a filmmaker, which means that you wear two hats of the supposed two cultures paradigm that exists in our culture, that is science versus the humanities, and you've already discussed some of the interesting perspectives, different perspectives that you as a filmmaker bring to this. As you say, failure would not be a central part of any textbook, for example. And this points to some interesting things that have developed around the controversy related to Donald Williamson. Traditionally in science, the means of dissemination has been through the peer review paper with an array of gatekeepers that are supposed to ensure the quality and the integrity of an idea. But heterodox ideas often are poorly supported, and they often don't fit into people's preconceived notions of the way things are, and they tend to be a little bit controversial. And your film presents this idea, this heterodox idea, in a very effective way. Now, you're at the forefront of electronic media and scientific communication. Where do you see scientific communication evolving from this traditional, fairly narrowly determined body of scientific literature to exploit the vast array of possibilities that the electronic revolution presents us?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I suppose we're already seeing some developments in that on the web you can now find papers published which, for instance, have not been through a peer review process, and they're usually clearly marked as such, and I think it's only a healthy thing that happens, that ideas can be put out there. I mean, the peer review process, it's clearly designed to, as you say, to safeguard the integrity of work, but one has to, I suppose, sometimes I think question what really goes on in a peer review process. I mean, if you're really at the forefront of your science, there are probably relatively few people who are your peers. Those few people, they know who you are, you know who they are. The chances of them reading your paper in as it were, open-minded or objective way, even though they haven't been told who actually wrote it, are very limited. They're going to know who's written this. And they're also going to have a view about it, because it's either going to confirm their own ideas or it's going to challenge their own ideas. And I think it's asking a lot of human nature to expect people to be, to be generous all the time. So I think the peer review process, whilst I wouldn't want to suggest it should be dismantled, is problematic. So the existence of these non-review or non-peered reviewed websites is excellent. As for the future of, for instance, scientific program making or the documentary film, I wonder really how much it will change. I mean, filmmakers rely on scientists for their stories. They rely on the cooperation of the scientific community, which is always very cooperative, and I think that's one of the great things about the scientific community. People are very generous with their time. But of course, everybody wants their story to be put across in a certain way, and there is a long history of presenting science in the way that we're all familiar with. The more sort of challenging, if you like, or form that I've chosen, for instance, for my film, I can't really see that becoming the norm. I think it's an experiment. It's if you like, a political film in that sense. It's trying to demonstrate that there are other aspects to the story. I mean, if you were talking about say political documentary filmmaking, it wouldn't be an unusual documentary. Filmmakers journalists are regularly and expected to be highly critical of politicians, but they are very rarely critical of scientists. So I think we're at the beginning of something, and whether it will take off or whether it can take off, given the if you like, the conservative pressures for it not to take off. I'm really not sure. I'm pushing in that direction. We'll have to see what happens.
It's always the eternal dilemma. Do you have the rule of law or do you have the Wild West? And which gives you the most creative way of looking at things and gives you the most effective way to advance the field? What's next on your agenda?
That's always a difficult question. I think I want to make another movie. What it will be exactly, I'm not sure. There are so many great stories in science which are as yet untold, there are many cases which mirror Williamson's story, you know, in across the whole broad range of science, and I'm interested in those figures who were somehow cut out of their own, either cut out of their own stories because they were, you know, I don't know, they were someone like Russell Wallace who came up with the same ideas as Darwin but is largely forgotten today, or ideas that simply were not of their time and were later resuscitated. And I've always wanted to make a film, for instance, about Ignaz Semmelweis, who may not be a name that you're familiar with.
Tell us about him.
But Semmelweis was an obstetrician in Vienna in the 1840s, and he noticed that in the hospital there that women who gave birth and were attended by midwives had a much greater chance of surviving the experience than those who were attended by doctors. and nobody understood why this should be the case, and there were various theories. One was that the priest who used to walk through the wards when there was had been a death would walk past these various women, and his presence would frighten them, and they would consequently, get ill and die. One theory was, there was bad air rising up from below in certain places. But what Semmelweis realized was that the doctors were regularly doing autopsies, and they were going straight from the operating theater or the autopsy room to help with the deliveries. And they weren't washing their hands because at the time there was no germ theory. Yeah. So Semmelweis suggested that what happened was that one of his friends who was a doctor accidentally cut himself when he was doing the autopsy, and he became very ill and he died of the same disease called childbirth fever as the women were dying of. And he put two and two together. He suggested people should wash their hands, and they did so in chlorinated water, and the death rate went right down. But the interesting part of it, that's interesting, but what happened next is particularly bizarre, because Semmelweis was thrown out of the hospital he was a Hungarian, and the hospital was in Vienna, and the Austrians were not pleased to be, as it were, impugned in this way, that they were somehow dirty, and he went back to Budapest, where he tried to do the same thing in the hospital there. His wife, who knows why, but she was prevailed upon to have him committed to an asylum. So what she did, so he was taken away by men in white coats. He resisted, he was beaten up, and he died of the same streptococcal infection that all the patients had been dying of. So he didn't have a chance. Within a few years, he had written a few papers, he'd done some experiments on rabbits, and he had really convinced himself that there was some matter that was being transferred from a dead body to a live person. This became accepted in Germany, and eventually Louis Pasteur came up with the germ theory that we all know of, and the rest is history. But poor Semmelweis just came a few years before his time.
He was a latter-day Bruno almost.
He was, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Robert Sternberg, thank you for joining us today, and your documentary, Hopeful Monsters, is going to be available at the link that you'll see in a little bit, as well as biographical details on yourself. And thank you very much for visiting us, and thanks for a very interesting conversation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your visit here.
Thank you very much.